So here we're looking at a very challenging essay simply because of the density of it, I think, McMahan's Death and the Value of Life. So just to start off, I'd like to just point out some of the distinctions that he makes. So we begin to maybe analyze it a little bit and take it, section by section, and also to think about the many principles or requirements that he looks at. So first of all, let's look at the very beginning of the essay, where he tells us what he's going to do, and this will enable us, I think, to break it down into more manageable parts. He says, in the first section of this paper, I will contend that the most influential of these arguments, that is, the arguments that death cannot be bad for the person who dies, that the most influential of these arguments fails to establish the conclusions which its defenders have sought from it. And that'll be the first section we'll look at. The second part, he says he will be developing an account of why it is that death can be bad for those who die. And thirdly, he will be looking at an apparent paradox, he says, which threatens this account, and conclude by proposing a way of dissolving the paradox. So really there's three different sections we need to try to understand. And the first section is a criticism of Epicurus, criticism of a certain interpretation of what Epicurus was about, and a suggestion of a couple ways of dealing with it. And I believe, if I'm right in my reading, that this first section runs from the beginning of the essay on page 233 until the middle of 242. And here he is looking at a version of the Epicurean argument, and he's basically reducing the Epicurean argument that death cannot be bad for the person who dies to one principle, and that is the so-called existence requirement. And he is suggesting two ways of dealing with that. Two ways of opposing it. One he calls the reconciliation strategy, where the idea is that what is being reconciled is the so-called existence requirement with our notion that death is indeed bad for the person who dies. The other strategy of dealing with the existence requirement is to reject it, and he seems to think that both of these are better than simply accepting the Epicurean position. So the first thing we need to let sink in here is what exactly the existence requirement is. This is to be found on page 234. The existence requirement is that, quote, a person can be the subject of some misfortune only if he exists at the time the misfortune occurs. So this is taken to be an implicit principle of the Epicurean view that death is nothing to us, that it is not, therefore, a bad thing for us. McMahan takes some pains to then distinguish the existence requirement from perhaps other requirements that are implicit in the Epicurean position, and those other requirements are the narrow experience requirement as well as the wide experience requirement. So the existence requirement says that someone has to exist in order to be the subject of a misfortune. That is, the general idea here is that we cannot say that something bad has happened to someone unless that someone exists. We see obviously that is a certain interpretation of the Epicurean idea that death is not bad for the person who dies. Why? Because death means the end of the existence of the person. So there is no subject to whom we can attribute the misfortune, because death does away with that subject, the subject being the living person. So if we say that death is a bad thing, it is a bad thing that doesn't happen to anyone, and therefore, under certain interpretations, it cannot be a bad thing, because for something to be bad, it has to be bad for someone, and since death takes away the someone, it cannot be said to be a bad thing. So that's the existence requirement. And then there are these two experience requirements. First, the narrow experience requirement, which he will reject pretty quickly, and then the wide experience requirement. which I think he has more sympathy for. And these are relevant for us in what we've read so far too, I think. What is the narrow experience requirement? That is also found on page 234. Narrow experience requirement is the principle that an event can be bad for a person only if he experiences it as bad. That is, that this goes to the whole idea of whether something can be bad for someone if they are not aware of the thing. That is, if they do not directly experience it in the sense of have the consciousness of the thing, the awareness of the thing. This is to be distinguished from the so-called wide experience requirement, which is also defined on page 234. The wide experience requirement, which holds that an event can be bad for someone only if it in some way affects or makes a difference to his conscious experience. This is somewhat reminiscent of our last essay, in which I think it was Rosenbaum who was looking at the idea of experience and asking, what are the conditions under which something can be said to be experienced? Do you have to be aware of something to experience it, or do you only need to be causally affected in some way by it to be said to experience it? And there's something similar going on here, not quite the same, but some similar distinction going on here. The narrow experience requirement would say that we have to be directly aware of something to be said to be a good or bad thing for us. The wide experience requirement would mean that our conscious experience would have to be in some way affected by the thing, even if we weren't aware of it. I'm thinking again of my example of the lost lottery ticket. That is, again, if you buy a lottery ticket and you forget that you buy it and it is destroyed, and it turns out to be a winner, but you never remember that you bought it, has a misfortune happen to you, under the narrow experience requirement, no, you cannot say that there's a misfortune, because obviously the conditions of the hypothetical mean that you are never aware, you never remember buying a ticket, so you cannot be aware of losing it. But under the wide experience requirement, it would seem that you can say that a misfortune has occurred. Why? Well, because the loss of that money that you would have otherwise have had, that is, the deprivation of that money, even though you're not aware of the deprivation, could be said, probably, to affect your conscious experience, that is, your further experience. Just because in one scenario where you remember you had the ticket and you save it and you cash it in, you have more money, and that means a certain effect on your conscious experiences. So you'll be able to do things that you were not able to do before, take trips, buy things, maybe give to charity and things like that. Whereas if you never have the ticket, those conscious experiences that would have resulted from cashing in the ticket will never occur. So one could say that under the wide experience requirement, that losing a lottery ticket but not being aware of the loss can be said to be a bad thing for you. Under the narrow experience requirement, that's not true. Now, of course, here we're talking about death, and one of the things that McMahan says in this first section is that if we accept the narrow requirement, the narrow experience requirement, then we cannot say that death is a bad thing for us, because we cannot be aware of our own death once it's occurred. I think that he accepts that, and that there's no question about it. But he says that if we accept the wide experience requirement only and not the narrow experience requirement, then we certainly can say that death can be a bad thing for us, because although we never become aware of our own death, we are affected in our conscious experience by our death, insofar as our conscious experiences then stop. So I think that's a very important distinction there. So hopefully those three things, the existence requirement, the narrow experience requirement, and the wide experience requirement, are things that are fairly familiar to us. We just have to keep them in mind. And so in the next essay, we'll look at his actual argument in